And welcome. My name is Tim Hanlon. I'm one of the pastors here at Calvary. I just want to welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are in the time of Advent, which, just as Jonathan was saying, this is the time where we anticipate the coming of Jesus, where we anticipate the one who is coming to redeem. Last week, Jamie talked about how Jesus overcomes the lies and the accusations of the enemy, depicted as the dragon out of Revelation 12. And he encouraged us, I think many of you remember, he encouraged us to put dragons in our nativity scenes. Did anyone do that? Anyone do that? Okay, Gabe did. My daughter drew this the other day. If you notice what it is, it's Joseph, Mary, the baby Jesus in the middle, and a dragon behind them. So she applied Pastor Jamie's message. So what I love about this is the dragon is kind of smiling in this picture. I don't know if you can tell. Anyway, I just thought that was fun. It doesn't necessarily have relevance for my message, but I just wanted to share that. But really, Advent is about anticipating. It's about the anticipation of coming. And so we do that in so many ways throughout this holiday season, throughout Christmas. How many of you are going to be welcoming family or friends into your home? Yeah, many of us. How many of you are going to be one of those people that will be welcomed into somebody's home? So there's that kind of anticipation. How many of us are looking forward to Santa Claus coming? Oh my gosh, did I just say that, Tim? Pastor Tim. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. But there's that whole aura and that whole essence of anticipation. Anticipation. Christmas gatherings, kind of in my mind, they're almost like mile markers where you see your family. Maybe you haven't seen them for a while, and it's almost as though those who are young in our family, it's like all of a sudden they have sprouted wings. And they're a foot taller. And also for those who are older in our family, we recognize the slow decline and aging of those whom we love most. It's like a mile marker. And I think perhaps that experience of welcoming people and recognizing the change in the growth or the aging in their faces is similar to Naomi. Naomi returning to Bethlehem in the book of Ruth, in the Old Testament book of Ruth. You've probably never heard a Christmas sermon based on the book of Ruth before, but I never heard one based on the book of Revelation either, so here we go. So from last week. We come to the story at the end of chapter 1. Naomi had been gone a long time. For 10 years, she'd been away from her hometown, Bethlehem. It's been a decade of survival. She and her family fled Bethlehem because of famine. But along the way, as they wandered in the land of Moab, one after another, her family members died. It began with her husband, Elimelech, and then her 2 sons died after him, and she was utterly alone. All that she had with her was the unrelenting loyalty of her Moabite daughter-in-law Ruth. So she comes home to Bethlehem 10 years older, 10 years more buried by her hunger, loss, and grief. And we pick up this story in chapter 1, starting in verse 19. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. What we see here in this passage is that there are multiple dimensions to the suffering and the burden that Naomi carries. First, we see that she is suffering in relationship to her losses. She's grieving. Naomi is arriving back to a world without the loved ones that she left with. And just as many of you have experienced in your life, when someone you love dies, their echoes can be felt in each moment and place and space. And I wonder what it would have been like for Naomi to walk these same streets that she held her children, to walk these same roads that she met her husband. The memories and echoes of loved ones lost can feel like tormentors. We also see with Naomi this aspect of suffering in relationship to other people. We see shame in this passage. Shame exists in being seen. The whole town sees Naomi. It appears that they don't even really know what to do with her. Is this Naomi? Is this that young lady who is such a delight? Oh my goodness, what? So horrible. What has happened to her? There's probably that sense of a panic. It's like the stirring is happening in the midst of the town. Who is this? Is this Naomi? Her calamity is noticed. 10 years of famine will age you. 10 years of grief can harden you. And in her world, where you get what you sow, in a world where calamity comes on those who do wrong, Naomi consigns herself to the margins. And in that, she is estranged from herself and from God. And we see this in the third aspect of her suffering, estrangement. Even her own name no longer fits her. She can't be Naomi, because Naomi actually means delightful, or it means pleasant. And she's like, this is who I am now is a far cry from pleasant. With what I've been through, the brokenness that I've experienced in my life. So she names herself Mara, which means bitter. From Naomi to Mara, from fullness to emptiness. And her conclusion is, even God is against me. And the last component or dimension of suffering that we see in this passage is clear throughout the rest of the book as well. It's practical and physical ruin. As widows, and especially for Ruth as a foreigner, they are vulnerable to exploitation. They have no inheritance or livelihood, things that are so important at this time for having a life that is vibrant and thriving. They have no land, no food, no property, no means to perpetuate dignity. They are impoverished. So it's an understatement, really, in light of all these things, it's an understatement to say that Naomi and Ruth are utterly barren, broken, and destitute. And I think maybe some of us in this room can relate to them. I'm sure some of us in this room, we look at these four elements of Naomi's suffering and we say, you know what, that is me. That is me right now. For me, this story hits home in a unique way. For the past 9 years, this time of year has been unique, if not strange, in its own kind of way. And really, the other day, I was with some friends, and one of them, she invited us to talk about our strangest Christmas experience. Her goal was to create just conversation, kind of lively, happy-go-lucky conversation with everyone. And it really worked. It worked. It created that sense of connection for most people. Everybody shared in turn. And I tried so hard to come up with something. I tried so hard to come up with something kind of interesting or funny, but I could not get past the reality. I couldn't shake the reality. You know, my strange Christmas experience was not going to foster carefree conversation. And so each person shared in turn. It got near to me, and people were like, oh, Tim, come on, you can share. And I totally changed the subject. I had a very cunning way of changing the subject. But I felt in that moment, and by no means was this anybody's fault, But in that moment, I felt just so estranged from everybody. Like I did not belong in that moment of joy or happiness. Our strangest Christmas experience, and I know many of you know this, was spent at a hospital 9 years ago on Christmas Day. Joanna was 39 weeks pregnant with our first child, but we hadn't felt the baby move all day. And so for peace of mind, we say, with mashed potatoes on the stove and turkey in the oven, quite literally, I remember we closed that front door saying, we'll be right back. And we didn't come right back. Like Naomi, 1 minute we were full, the next empty. One moment we were pleasant, the next we were bitter. One moment we were innocent, the next we became stricken. In a night, it's like we had wandered 10 years through famine, arriving back to a world that didn't know us anymore, arriving back to a world that didn't know what to do with us, arriving back to definitions of ourselves that no longer fit us. Our son, Asa Timothy, he was born the following day at 6 pounds, 12 ounces. Our son was a full-term stillborn. Maybe you're like Naomi too. Maybe you're like her in some way. Maybe you know grief and shame and estrangement and physical challenge and ruin. And to the extent that Christmas is a time of merriment for so many of us, to the extent that it's also a time of debilitating sorrow for some of us. Incredible heartache for many of us, where the absence of your loved ones is so real. And many of you know that feeling where there's that chair that Uncle Joe or your husband or your wife or your child used to sit, and the emptiness of that chair is resounding on Christmas. Or maybe you feel ashamed. You're ashamed of who you are. Maybe you say to yourself, if people really knew me, they would abandon me. They would write me off. And so in turn, you've already abandoned yourself and you feel worthless and illegitimate. Maybe you feel far off from God. In this sense, Naomi, 100%, she feels far off from God. She's saying, how could God possibly love me? Maybe you're thinking that. How could God possibly love me? I've done so much. I've run so far. I've wandered so far away. I'm so bad. Or you're struggling physically or financially. Pastor Tim, I thought this sermon was about joy. Why are we talking so much about all this hard stuff? I think in order to experience joy in Advent, we must know sorrow. And this is the question that I want to ask us today, is how do we experience joy in Advent? Number one, by knowing sorrow. I don't know who wrote this, but I heard this the other day. Feelings are like children. You don't want them driving the car, but you can't stuff them in the trunk either. I see some nods. You understand. You've tried to stuff your kids in the trunk. You understand that. We, the same. We do this with our feelings, though, don't we? We do this with our sorrow. We want to subjugate it to the back seat or to the trunk where it can't infringe upon our lives. And thank God we have these amazing counselors here at Calvary who can help us to kind of order those depths and those areas of brokenness in our lives. And I highly recommend them. But this might seem counterintuitive, but if we numb our sorrow, we also numb our joy. We often talk about how joy is deeper than happiness, how joy is fuller, it stays. And I think in order for it to be that way, it has to begin deeply. Joy begins in sorrow, in brokenness, in unrealized dreams, in the chaos of our families where kids are throwing tantrums and there's stirring and rifts in our relationships with other people. It begins 6 feet underground in grief, in the barrenness of our lives. And the beauty of Christianity, like the absolute most beautiful thing, one of the most beautiful things about this thing called following Jesus, is that it does not sugarcoat reality. It allows us the freedom to sorrow. It allows us the freedom to live as things actually are. But as many of you know, like, this is not typically how we expect each other to act as followers of Jesus. Oftentimes it's like, you should be more happy. If you're a follower of Jesus, you should put on a happy face. You should smile more. I mean, that's not what God is expecting of us. God does not need the perfect family photos. Speaking of, I just put that up there. I like to insert little things here and there that I'm just kidding. Now, this actually has a point. I mean, this is not what God is expecting. And you know how we got to this point, don't you? I mean, you know how this story happened, right? It takes chaos to get those pictures. I have these memories from my childhood of certain family members, I will not name them just in case they're watching, who would go through they were really dedicated to getting a perfect family picture. And I remember them, and I look at these pictures, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm only like 5 years old, but I remember that day like it was yesterday. I think that's what tears and trauma do during these pictures. So these pictures, they happen through physical force and tears, as you can clearly see. I'm being so vulnerable with you all today. But you know what? God is not expecting, he does not want to put on his mantle the perfect family picture, right? This is okay on his mantle. He already knows it, by the way. He's okay putting that on his mantle. Meanwhile, we spend so much time of our lives trying to show how we're better than we are, or how we smile more than we are. But in Advent, we're actually invited to look beyond the facade. We are invited to sorrow. So here's a question for us today. What does barrenness or suffering or sorrow look like for you as you approach Christmas? So our overall question this morning is, how do we experience joy in Advent? Firstly, know our sorrow. And in that, or really because of that, we can rightly long for healing and redemption, which is the second point, is to long for redemption. How do we experience joy in Advent? We experience sorrow and we long for redemption. And we see that so clearly in the book of Ruth. Without the experience of being broken and destitute, Naomi and Ruth wouldn't have needed redemption. They would have been fine. They wouldn't have needed God to come through in a miraculous, profound way. But it's in the profound lack of our lives that God demonstrates his redeeming power, where he goes beyond anything that we could have ever expected. So let's remember that this story was set in a world away from ours. This was a patriarchal society where male representation was paramount to the function of a healthy social structure. So having said that, these ladies, these women, they come back to Bethlehem without the support of a husband and sons, and without ancestral land. So these widows, ultimately, they don't have bread on the family. I mean, that's the result of not having that kind of representation. They are left at the mercy of landowners who might or might not allow Ruth, who was a foreigner, see, all the chips are stacked against them, to glean in their fields. And gleaning was just being able to come after the harvesters and take the food that remained. So let's taste the intensity of this vulnerability. They are literally left with the scraps of life. They have no power or money. All they have is hope in this God-initiated justice system that looks after the orphan, the poor, the widow, and the foreigner. But this system is so often neglected throughout the Old Testament. So really, their chances of being helped, it hangs in the balance of the kindness of others. And so as poor, powerless widows, really what they need in this social context, they need a redeemer. They need redemption. They need what was called at that time a kinsman redeemer. You can learn more about that in Leviticus 24. I think it's 24. In the Old Testament, a redeemer was an actual person who would help their own relatives who were destitute. Possibly they had to sell themselves into slavery. Possibly they had to sell their lands or their homes or what have you because they fell into some form of financial ruin. And so the Redeemer would come and bring dignity and help that person to come out of destitution. And so essentially it's socioeconomic focused. Being delivered from physical destitution and being reinstated to a place of holistic dignity. That's what they need in the kinsman redeemer. And so Boaz, in the book of Ruth, please read this when you go home. Boaz is identified as a possible kinsman redeemer. He's a close relative and is capable of providing them support and dignity through marrying Ruth and assuming the responsibility for their needs and perpetuating their family line. And really, through the absolute savvy, strategic ingenuity of Naomi, she is brilliant. And through Ruth's profound depth and character and courage, and also through the loving kindness of Boaz, Boaz marries Ruth and redeems them. So that's all the technical stuff. But the point of the story, please don't allow this to infer that you need to get married. That's not the point of the story. Or that patriarchy is the best kind of social structure. That's not the point of the story. The heart of this story is that sorrow and destitution can be redeemed and restored. For Naomi, it's less about Boaz and more about what we see in chapter 4. So chapter 4, verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse or his caretaker. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. To Naomi, this child is the redeemer of the story. This is an anomaly in the Old Testament because always the Redeemer was an adult. Obed, this baby, he saves Naomi from a life of destitution. He gives her a new future free from bitterness, shame, and estrangement. He is the continuation of her family line. His birth really signifies a complete restoration of all that was lost. And this passage also points to the fact that the baby was for far more than just the hope of their immediate family. I mean, you see all of the women come out, and they collectively share in the redemption together. They name him together as a community. And also historically, we see that the book of Ruth was written during the time of the Judges, which was a time of turmoil and chaos. And there's a real sense during this time that everything was irredeemable, that all was lost. Yet here, with this child, there is a strand of hope in the midst of this, emphasized, again, in this child and what would come through him. So a question for us today, another question: what causes you to long for redemption? Really, just like Naomi and Ruth, without the experience of being broken, we wouldn't know our need for redemption. We wouldn't need God to show up in our lives, but it's in profound lack that God demonstrates his redeeming power. So how do we experience joy in Advent? Firstly, know our sorrow. Secondly, long for redemption. And thirdly, behold the child. Again, this child Obed that Naomi cares for on her lap, this is the Redeemer for her. It's her restoration. It's her completion. And so it's not so far-fetched to see then how a baby's birth can completely change everything. And my intention is to not put a spotlight upon you or to put you on the spot in any way, but perhaps better than any of us, you women and couples who have struggled with infertility, you know more than any of us how a child or the lack of a child changes everything. You know how it has amended the course and the trajectory of your lives. You felt the weight in your heart and soul, the shame, the yearning to hold a child. And so I'd say, you, my friends, my precious friends, you have the capacity and the ability to show us what it means to long for a child as a church, to help us to see what it means to long for redemption, to yearn for restoration. So when we experience sorrow, it's almost like we're given a key that opens a door of longing. We're yearning for the things to be made right again. We're hoping for a Redeemer who makes all things new. And Advent is about longing for the coming of a child that changes everything. And this child has come. So in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 2, I'll begin reading. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. Verse 6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. The child has come. He's been born to us. He's come to bring restoration as our counselor, as our God, as our peacemaker. On Obed's grandson David's throne he sits, manifesting the fullness of redemption that Naomi really, she just caught a small glimpse of this. The very redemption that we can all know in the very darkest, most difficult corners of our lives. And I think this kind of a redemption, it's exemplified in a short poem that my wife Joanna wrote. And she wrote this not long after we lost our son Asa. And so I want to read it to you just as we close this morning. And this is patterned off of the hymn, O Sacred Head Now Wounded, if you are familiar with that. O sacred womb, now broken, betrayed by death's untimely claim, your walls of warmth and comfort transformed to space of pain. Oh, speak and tell me how his life did come to be a tale of pain and sorrow, a path of suffering. O sacred tomb, now empty, redeemed through suffering, your walls of death and darkness have lost their final sting. Oh, speak and tell me how his death did come to be, a tale of hope in sorrow, a seed of life in me. When we behold the child Jesus, we behold a God who enters our brokenness, a God who enters our shame and our sorrow, a God who takes on our pain. We behold a counselor, a healer, a peacemaker, our King. We behold a God who's so zealous that he'll do whatever it takes to bring about redemption, restoration, and joy for his children, even to the point of his own defacement, humiliation, and death on a cross. The birth of Jesus and the death of Jesus is a tale of hope in sorrow. It's a seed of life. It's a seed of joy. So my last question for us this morning, what would it look like for you to behold, for all of us, to behold Jesus this Christmas season? Let's pray. God, we thank you that you have come to answer the question of our deepest longings, our deepest sorrows. God, thank you that you redeem us and that in your redemption, we experience fullness of joy. Amen.